Welcome to the panel entitled Russian State and Society, How Sustainable is the New Consolidation? I believe that a key message to emerge from yesterday's discussion was the realization that Russian foreign policy is to a significant extent driven by domestic goals, considerations, and concerns. In fact, as one of the speakers yesterday pointed out, it is highly likely that ultimately change can only come from within Russia. And it is in this context that I believe the question about the sustainability of the current state-society consolidation is an extremely important one. And this panel will provide an opportunity to assess the prospects for domestic stability and change from a number of different angles. My name is Piret Tehin. I'm the director of the Center for EU-Russia Studies at the University of Tartu. This is the institution that is convening this particular panel of the conference. And I am very pleased to introduce our panelists today. Our first speaker is Brian Taylor. He's a professor of political science and director of the Center for European Studies at Syracuse University. Brian has conducted research for many years on power institutions of the Russian state. He's a leading expert on the Siloviki, and his presentation today will address the question, is the Russian state strong or weak? Our second speaker is Natalia Yudina. She's a chief expert at the Moscow-based Sova Center. This is an NGO that monitors nationalism, racism, and political radicalism in Russia. Also on the panel is Natalia Zubarevich, professor at Moscow State University and director of the regional program at the Independent Institute for Social Policy. She's a leading expert on economic and social development in the Russian regions, and she's the author of the famous concept of four Russias. And finally, our fourth speaker is Vyacheslav Morozov, professor of EU-Russia Studies at the University of Tartu. He has published extensively on Russian national identity and foreign policy, in particular Russia's relations with Europe. The rules of procedure for the panel are such that I ask the speakers to limit their remarks to a maximum of 15 minutes, and I will signal if you're running out of time. This should leave half an hour for discussion. And as a quick clarification, even though the program says we only have 1 hour for the panel, this would not be fair since all of the panels yesterday had 90 minutes. And we got a permission from the organizers to take an hour and a half. The break for refreshments will be slightly shorter as a result. But without further ado, I would like to pass the floor to our first speaker, Brian Taylor, please.
Thanks, Piret, and thanks to the Baltic Defense College and the University of Tartu for the invitation. As Piret said, I'm going to talk about, is the Russian state strong or weak? And the answer is the Russian state is weak. If you want to just tune out for the next 10 minutes, that's the basic answer. But let me develop it a bit. So the title of the panel is, How Stable is the New Consolidation? And my answer to that question, which reflects on the shorter answer to the question about the strength of the state, is that at the level of state institutions and governance, the new consolidation, or we might call it a new mobilization, is both a short-term temptation and a medium-term trap. It's a temptation because it's easier to rule than to govern, and hopefully that distinction in English is clear between ruling and governing. If not, I can unpack it a bit. And it's a trap because ruling instead of governing leads to more mistakes and ineffective state policy, ultimately weakening the country. So in terms of the organization of the talk, it's divided into two basic parts. In the first part, I'm going to give a brief sketch of the political system in Russia, which I will call Putinism. And in the second part of the talk, I'll elaborate on why I think this new consolidation is a temptation and a trap. So first on the political system. Putinism as a political system has two basic features. The first is what scholars of political science like to call electoral authoritarianism. So at the formal level, you have a constitutional commitment to democracy, to a separation of powers, to semi-presidentialism with shared power between a president and prime minister, to federalism, to judicial review invested in the Supreme Court, and respect for individual rights, free media, and civil society. In reality, under an electoral authoritarian system, all these constitutional guarantees are subverted by fake elections, centralization of authority in the Kremlin, weakening of parliament, courts, and regional and local governments, and various infringements on rights of groups, media, and individuals who are, shall we say, less than loyal to the ruling regime. So that's one piece of it, electoral authoritarianism. The second and more important piece is a set of informal clan networks where real political and economic power is based and which fight between themselves over resources, access to the top decision maker, and power. So those two features, again, electoral authoritarianism and informal clan networks. This observation is not novel and comes with many names. Richard Sakwa calls it the dual state. Kononenko and Moses call it the network state. Henry Hale calls it patronal presidentialism. And some people, including Alyona Lyadyanova and Gleb Pavlovsky, who's a Russian, what they call a political technologist, simply call it sistema, the system. And for the purposes of this talk, I think you can also simply call it Putinism. One of the things that Pavlovsky, this Russian political insider, notes in a recent book is that Putin is simultaneously the president of the formal state, the state number one, and the boss of the more informal and more important network state that exists parallel to the formal state. Now, in the beginning, this is not a biblical phrase, but in the beginning, in the early Putin years, there were some people who hoped, and there were indeed some signs, that Putin would actually be a real president and not simply a boss. Alexander Rohr referred to him as the German in the Kremlin, who was going to create an effective state after the administrative weaknesses of the 1990s and the various predations of the oligarchs and the regional barons. And some steps, I would say, in Putin's first term in particular, were consistent with this vision. But in the end, his role as boss became more important than his role as president. Instead of empowering state and societal institutions that had an important role in governance, in real democracy, actual activity was directed towards taking competing networks and clans and making them all submit to a single pyramidical structure, the so-called vertical of power. But if you imagine a pyramid, right, it's actually kind of hard to build a pyramid from the top without a substructure underneath it. So even though he did in some ways achieve the single pyramidical structure he wanted, in relation to him, two key problems remained. First, the clans that existed were still in competition with each other for power and resources. And indeed, Putin needed multiple clans competing with each other to maintain his position as the key arbiter of conflicts. And second problem is it's much easier to monitor these groups for loyalty than it is to monitor them for effectiveness in achieving state goals and plans set out to advance national interests. This is especially true when the real forms of feedback and accountability that are existing in the formal structure, such as parliaments, courts, elections, the media, and civil society, are disabled. Now, as an aside, I should note here that some people believe there was never actually any interest on the part of Putin and those around him in building an effective state or promoting national interests, and that they are simply interested in stealing things. Edward Lucas said this yesterday, and Karen Dawisha has a whole book out about it called Putin's Kleptocracy. And if you read Alexei Navalny's blog, The Opposition Blogger, you will see this position represented frequently. I'm not going to pursue that argument here. I'll take them at their word that they were interested in creating a more effective state. But the result is, ultimately, I would say, a weak and ineffective state in which contests over policy are diverted from the formal institutions to informal struggles, and the elite renewal functions that institutions are supposed to play don't actually work. So if we look at Russia cross-nationally and compare it to other countries at similar levels of economic development, Russia has strikingly weak and ineffective state institutions given how wealthy the country is and how modern much of its society is. This has to do with the rule of law, corruption, protection of property rights, effective regulation, et cetera. And for those who want a more empirical reference for this, I would direct you to the World Bank's Worldwide Governance Institute's data set, in which you can compare Russia to other countries of similar levels of development, and you'll see how strikingly weak Russia is in comparison. All right, the second piece, why a temptation and a trap? It's a temptation because, at least in the last 8 months, it seems clear that decision-making has been simplified for many important issues because of the crisis having to do with Ukraine. So decisions are taken by Putin and a small number of advisors, and reportedly with greater influence from the Federal Security Service, the FSB, than had been the case before. Now, in some ways, this decision-making structure is more attractive than working through various reports from multiple agencies and setting up interagency commissions and having expert analysis conducted, et cetera. Allegedly, for the 4 years when Putin was prime minister, he hated the staggering volume of reports and paper that he was expected to familiarize himself with in the job. It's much easier to be a czar and rule with a small circle of trusted advisors. But this is also a trap. An already flawed decision-making process, because of this mismatch between the formal institutions and the informal networks, has become even more ineffective. So just to give you a series of examples, the Russian government introduced so-called reverse food sanctions without any input from the Ministry of Agriculture. They changed internet regulations when the deputy prime minister responsible for communications was out of town. The parliament is not a body for writing, discussing, or perfecting legislation, but simply what some Russian journalists like to call a mad printer that passes whatever comes from the presidential administration. To take a somewhat more trivial example, but I think a telling one, the Russian Football Association couldn't decide what it should do about the football teams from Crimea, whether they should be brought into the Russian league or not, so they had to send someone to ask Putin if this is what they should do or not. Because the business owners who own these football clubs were afraid they would be sanctioned if they allowed such a decision to take place. So the decision-making process, which was already lacking in relevant institutional checks from outside the executive branch, has become even more concentrated and therefore prone to mistakes. And anything can be justified as a response to the current emergency. So if you're Rosneft, you can ask for money from the sovereign wealth funds to compensate for your own poor development and borrowing decisions. And the Security Council is busy preparing and perfecting a whole list of security programs: food security, information security, medical security, anti-extremism strategies, et cetera. And the long-term tendency, well, the medium-term tendency is towards more resources for defense and for security and for the economic interests of Putin's cronies than investment in human capital, such as education or healthcare, or institutional reform. Indeed, if we go back to before Maidan, go back a year, the summer of 2013, the key issue being discussed among the Russian political and expert economic community was why Russia was facing economic stagnation at a time of record high world oil prices. If you're reading the New York Times, you might think the main things they were concerned about a year ago were Pussy Riot and gay propaganda, but really what was going on in elite discussions was why was the economy stagnating? Growth had become decoupled from high oil and gas rents, and Medvedev's so-called modernization simply hadn't happened. Productivity was low, investment was low, and human capital spending was low. The economy was uncompetitive both with developed economies that have high rates of productivity and innovation and developing economies that have lower wages and dynamic manufacturing sectors. So Russia had become, in the 15 years since Putin came to power, more dependent than ever on oil and gas. So the trap here, because of the Ukraine crisis, is that the prospect for institutional reform to change this economic situation and to increase investment and reduce capital flight and modernize the economy has completely disappeared from the agenda over the last 8 months. And instead, we see situations like with the oil firm Bashneft, one of the largest formerly private oil companies that was recently seized by the state, and the billionaire who held these shares is now under house arrest, which suggests that the protection of property rights is even less secure than before the current crisis. So again, just to summarize, At the level of state institutions and governance, this new consolidation is a temptation in the short term and a trap in the medium term. And it's a temptation because it's easier to rule like a czar than govern like a president. And it's a trap because ruling instead of governing leads to more mistakes and ineffective state policy, which ultimately weakens the country and the state. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for outlining for us the strength and mostly weaknesses of the formal and informal dimension of the Russian state. Our next speaker is Natalia Yudina, who will give us an update on nationalism and political radicalism in the Russian society.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Excuse me for my English, I will read on paper. The political consolidation of Putin's regime rose to new heights in 2014, and not only due to his 85% popularity rating. The important part is what exactly these people support. This unparalleled political support rallied by the Kremlin is not entirely the result of the propaganda campaign against the Kiev junta or Bandera followers. Unlike the previous years, the regime has now worked out its own ideology, a nationalist one. Of course, the racial or ethnic nationalism that prevails in the streets could not be adopted as the government's official policy. It was therefore replaced by a milder version, an odd mixture of political nationalism, although without the civil or democratic component, and so-called civilizational nationalism, a concept based on the uniqueness of the Russian civilization, as opposed to the West. Yet, ethnic nationalism cannot be entirely excluded from nationalism as the official policy. This much is obvious from what is happening in Ukraine today. The affronting for the Russian vote, or for Russians, which suggests that the national unity concept, understood as a Russian civilization-based unity, still involves some ethnic bias. Savat Center for Information and Analysis focuses on studying the nationalist movement in Russia, and this report will be mainly centered on how it faced the most recent political consolidation and the war in Ukraine, and how the government's response to it. The year 2013 brought a really unexpected turn in development of nationalism in Russia. While the 2012, the Kremlin launched various propaganda campaigns against the opposition that relied on many Russian xenophobic sentiments, but its ethnic policy remained unchanged. Things changed in the beginning of 2013, or as I think at least from spring 2013. An unexpected anti-migrant campaign was launched by the governments of several Russian regions, including Moscow and St. Petersburg. In Moscow, this policy change could be explained by mayoral elections, but no elections in St. Petersburg that year. What's more, the campaign was eagerly supported by federal TV channels. Police raids and increasingly frequent prosecution of non-citizens were only one aspect of that campaign. How and how often this was shown to the public was far more important. That campaign led to unprecedented rise of ethnic xenophobia in Russia. Yet, it could be considered a breakdown because it was short-lived. It began in spring and ended around October or November, I think. Still, radical nationalists immediately responded to the government's call by a series of moves of their own, from political rallies to so-called raids. Incidentally, even the pro-Kremlin Rodina party that staged similar raids and continues doing so. In fact, raids as a moderately violent but safe form of activity had been used by ultra-right groups. They intensified in 2012. In 2013, Russian cleanings surged an unprecedented scale, involving nationalist groups such as the Shield of Moscow or Bright Rose and some others. At the same time, our observations showed a description of 2009-2012 downward trend in racist violence. All of this has definitely increased the importance of the violence aspect in the discussion of Russian nationalism. Radical nationalist groups gained popularity due to the media attention they were getting as a part of the anti-migrant campaign. The authorities even had to slow down some of the most urgent voluntaries, helping them fight illegal immigration. The Russian nationalist movement entered a period of optimistic expectations. Admittedly, few of those expectations were actually associated with any official political activity, although many ultra-right movements tried to register their own political parties, but only a few of them actually succeeded. Sergei Baburin, Russian National Union, and Dmitry Rogozin's Rodina Party. However, even those two oldest parties have not been entrusted the authority to communicate the government's ideas to the public. The Russian vote ideas are being conveyed by pro-government agencies. Other nationalists failed to register their parties. At the first half of 2014, active Russian citizens' attentions were riveted on Ukraine. The fight against fascists and Bandera follows, then partly ousted national ideas and even made them taboo. For the first time in the month, opinion polls showed lowering levels of xenophobia, while the general anti-Bandera sentiments entered into conflict with the essential content of ultra-right group main activities. The anti-migrant sentiments faded. One important and unexpected outcome of the Ukrainian events was the reconfiguration of the nationalist movement. The Ukrainian crisis, which began with clashes in Grushevskoye Street, revived nationalists' hope for the white revolution success in Russia. The Maidan riots were seen as a positive example, especially for one overstated the right sector's role. The transition from the government versus opposition conflict to a different phase that can be described as ethnic Ukrainians versus ethnic Russians made Russian nationalists face a difficult choice. While the opposition-minded part of nationalists initially supported the Maidan protesters, serious disagreements emerged among them later. The leaders of publicly active organizations have been the most outspoken. As expected, most nationalist organizations approved the annexation of Crimea and so-called Russian Spring. They all view the conflict in Ukraine as a battle that pits ethnic Russians against ethnic Ukrainians and the West. Thus, even groups that view the Moscow regime as anti-Russian support our own people in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine. Few of these groups oppose the Russian Spring. They include the majority of leaders among the Russians associations, so-called Ruskiye, and some others. Ironically, their statements closely resemble those made by their sworn enemies in the liberal opposition. These nationalists contend that both Russians and Ukrainians in Ukraine would do better to live under the Kiev authorities, or better still independently, than under they see as Putin's anti-Russian regime. The majority of Russian nationalists are anonymous militants that don't belong to any formal political organizations and who are also in disagreement to Ukraine. With the conflict growing into full-fledged war, it's important to note that there are supporters to different viewpoints on both sides of the front line of eastern Ukraine. According to rough estimates, at least 200 nationalists are fighting for Novorossiya, maybe more. Less known organizations are more active in sending fighters to the conflict area, such as Alexander Barkashov, Russian National Unity, or the National Liberation Movement. One thing is still clear though. Those Russians who are fighting in Novorossiya are people of different backgrounds and viewpoints, and few of them are associated with specific nationalist organizations. Still fewer facts are known about those fighting on the other side. Most of them, if not all, are neo-Nazis, but there are different types among them. New splits between nationalists could be weakened at the movement that is used to disagreement, but this new schism is of a different nature. The Russian Spring supporters are actually parroting the federal channel statements because they have no policy of their own. The opponents feel vulnerable, not only due to concentrated pressure from the police, but also because while being used to considering themselves at the forefront of the majority of the nation, they have now found themselves at the minority. The war in Ukraine was overshadowed many other problems. While the opposing leaders are still capable of reaching some agreement, common nationalists, especially militant nationalists, are reluctant to compromise on this sensitive issue and prefer avoiding any contact with political leaders. This much has become obvious from the record low number of participants in this 4th of November, the Russian March, famous for us Russian nationalist event. On the other hand, we can see that the number of racist attacks is not going down. According to our preliminary estimates, at least 114 people have suffered from violence motivated by xenophobia or neo-Nazism. 19 of them died. These figures are bound to increase even more. Many of those now fighting in Donbass will soon return to Russia with their dream of white revolution that no longer seems so fantastic. Moreover, the ethnic enhanced capacity rhetoric used by the Russian government during the Ukrainian crisis clearly legitimizes violence. Therefore, radical right-wing forces may sharply intensify their activities here in Russia, in yet another aftermath of this war. Although we cannot predict the nature of mechanism of that activity at this stage, it remains a mere realistic possibility. In conclusion, I would like to note that the political consolidation of Russian society around the Kremlin on scale is a surprising event for Putin's regime is a fact now. This consolidation is fraught with social quakes that are impossible to avoid or even predict. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Natalia. The fact that Russian nationalists are fighting on both sides of the conflict in eastern Ukraine clearly tells us that the international implications of the rise of nationalism in Russia are very complex. Our next speaker is Natalia Zubarevich. Natalia, is it the case that instead of one Russia, we should be talking about several?
Thank you very much for invitation. I feel myself a little bit strange because I'm a quantitative analysis. So talking to political scientists is something new for me because I use figures and only figures to make my comments clear and basically. Let me strengthen three main factors. Devaluation, 30% compared with a year before. Oil price drop started in this summer and now 30% drop. And sanctions. Sanctions are very painful, but please do not overestimate their influence. The other factors are, let me say, much more important. First of all, what is the price? The oil, price for Russia's economy. Oil price drop means 90 billion losses per year for Russian economy. And sanctions is only 40 billion losses. It's an estimation of Ministry of Finance, Russian ministry, and 50 billion losses is estimation of central bank, Russian central bank. The more painful is capital outflow. This year it will be about $230 billion. And additionally, it is the problem of dependence on machinery and equipment import. It's very clear. Russian authorities really understand these problems, but the question is, Do we have a time to overcome this problem? Because to create new techniques for oil extracting industry, for agriculture, it's a big problem for Russian Federation. I tried to describe the main features, but being a regional scientist, I tried to describe it mainly in regional aspects. First of all, I can agree with my colleague, Russia's problem started at least year and a half before the Crimea problems. The start for stagnation is the end of 2012, November, December. And now we clearly face stagnation during the 2013 and these years. Industrial output, 0 in previous year, and now 1.5 growth, only due to devaluation. It's some kind of changes, the shortage of car import and processing there inside Russia, the shortage of food import and growth of food industry in Russia. But it is a short-term effect for dynamics. The more problematic is the investment decline, because investments create a future for economy. Previous year, it was nearly 0, but this year it's minus 5.5%. And you can see that inside all Russian regions, we face nearly half of them with investment decline. Politically more painful for Russian authorities is the stagnation of personal incomes. It was the same in the crisis year, but it was clear for everybody. And what are the reasons for personal income stagnation now? It's very difficult to explain, but you know the very simple explanation, and it uses every day in Russia. We are surrounded by enemies, so our incomes stop to grow, and so on and so forth. Adding to investment problems, let me show you the direct foreign investment dynamics. The level of investment is low compared with year before crisis, and it doesn't grow. The growth of previous year was the special counting offshore buying by one Russian oil extracting company by the other. Now, let me strengthen these figures. China FDI share, it's only 1%. Describing the situation with alternative connection, Russia with Eastern country, please look at the share of Far East in foreign direct investment. It's only 9%, and first of all due to Japan and American investment to oil and gas industry, not Chinese. Is it possible to turn Russian economy to the east? Let's show. The China share in Russian export is less than 7%. No infrastructure for export, but the China import to Russia is 70%. And it's very easy to grow up the import flows, and it's very difficult to make wider and higher the level of export. it takes a lot of investment to increase this export. This is dynamic of this export. And the other, additionally, what about geography of Russian export and import? Russia is clearly divided on two unequal parts. The regions nearly the regions of European part, Western Siberia, and part of Eastern Siberia are oriented to the West, and only Far East and regions close to Baikal are mainly oriented to the eastern countries. And it means it's very difficult to change this orientation. What about influence on Russian budget? New problems connected with Crimea and changes in Russian foreign activities. Please look at this structure. This is the share of different revenues to federal budget. These two are strongly connected with oil and gas price, not sanctions. First of all, oil and gas prices. They are much more important for Russia, for future development of our country. But being the country with independent finance system, Russia has a key instrument to minimize this influence. Please look at this. When oil drops $1 per barrel, it means Russian losses are 90 billion rubles. But when ruble goes down to $1 for 1 ruble, it means additional revenues for Russian budget about 190 to 100 billion dollars. The system is easily equalizing, no problem till now. Ruble is getting cheaper, but budget is fulfilling quietly, no problems. What about stability of Russian budget concerning the geography of taxes and revenues? Nearly 28% of total budget revenues, federal budget units, are gathered from one territory, Khanty-Mansi Autonomous Okrug. Moscow 16, gas extracting Yamal Autonomous District, and 5% additionally St. Petersburg. 4 regions, 60%. Now you can clearly understand what is oil for Russia. Russian budget has problem not in sanctions field. Russian budget system faced a big problem inside. After Putin's decrees to increase salaries and wages for public sector employers, we faced huge destabilization of, first of all, of regional budget, because you know the system. I think the people who are invited clearly understand the Russian system. All the bad decisions should be dropped down to the regional level. All the super politically positive decision I'm making on the top. It's a very balanced system. And now we faced huge deficit of regions' budget. It's about 8%. When I show this picture for Americans, what's the problem? The answer, please remember Detroit. But we are not Detroit. 8% of deficit is big enough. But look at the 2/3 of Russian regions has a bigger deficit, and some nearly 25%. The second, the result of the deficit is a huge problem of debts. 40% of Russian regions have the debt higher than at least half of their income, revenues without transfers, their own revenues. And this problem has no decision. And 41% of all these debts are the debts for commercial banks. With the interest rate, you clearly understand, it's about 10% per year. And this problem is not solved till now. And two comments concerning sanctions themselves. What are the main problems? First of all, milk and meat. This is the share of Russia import in total production and total consumption in Russia. The milk, the share of milk, you can see, the share of milk is getting higher, importing milk products. The share of meat and meat products is getting shorter. Why? Due to the real successes in several industries. This is the drop of a number of cattle, pigs, but here is the meat production. And you may see that poultry is on the way. We nearly cover all our needs in poultry. There is a big enough progress in pork production. And the problem is cattle. But we import cattle from Brazil, 40%, and very few amount from Western countries. So it means we faced problems, it's true, but please do not overestimate these problems. These problems are rooted in the other sphere. I can't translate, please, my colleague, help me, to very specific term. Это семена, элитный скот, вот.
Seeds,
elite cattle. Breeding cattle. These are the problem to improve the quality of your cattle. We buy nearly all breeding cattle, nearly all seeds for our agriculture. It's a key problem. The other key problem, we import the huge amount of machinery and equipment for nearly all industries. The estimations of Andrei Klepich, previously Vice Ministry of Economics, it is that import now gives gives 80% of all new equipment, 80% of all new machinery and equipment. And it's a key problem for Russia because many industries are not able to produce without import components, import machinery, and so on. What about Crimea? Oh, I have no time for Crimea, sorry. So, thank you.
We can certainly return to Crimea later on in the discussion part of our panel. I would now like to turn the floor to Vyacheslav Morozov, who promised to enlighten us about ideological developments and anti-Westernism in the Russian society.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Piret. I think I will more or less pick up where Natalia left it, but turn it from hard facts to soft developments in the field of ideology and identity politics. We have been hearing a lot, including during this conference, about Russia's attempts to develop alternative values, conservative, family values, alternative to the West, position Russia as a separate, distinct civilization, insist even that Russia is not Europe. And then there is, of course, a separate development, but related, Russia's pivoting to Asia. Asia as the new kind of land of dawn for Russia, the new dimension where prosperity is to be found and independence from Western imperialism and hegemonism. And my key argument is basically the same as Natalia's, that, Russian identity discourse, identity politics, and the whole ideological field remains very much dependent on Europe and the West. And the outlook remains very much Eurocentric. I won't be able to produce hard evidence, I mean, in terms of, as hard as it can get, of course, in terms of quotes and so on, but so you will have to believe me, but simply because there is no time. But I will simply summarize the debate as I see it, and then, of course, for quotes and everything else, there is enough published on the topic, actually. So let me just say that, first of all, of course, when we look at the opinion polls data, yes, there is obviously a huge degree of consolidation around the flag, so to say, around the figure of the president in the first place. Opinion polls continue to show huge support for Putin personally, and a huge degree of anti-Westernism. There is definitely the US and the West in general, including actually the EU these days, come as the main enemies in all polls, including those by independent agencies, and China figures as potentially one of the main friendly countries, one of the main partners, and so on. But of course, if you look deeper and behind the opinion poll figures, you will see that, of course, first of all, these are the results of propaganda, which in itself is not based on something new. And the building blocks of this anti-Westernism, of this new anti-Westernism, are actually very old, and what is exploited in this new anti-Western discourse is actually old Soviet and even pre-Soviet construction material, which is being simply put together in a new form, if you want. But sometimes it's not even new. First of all, one important and probably crucial aspect of this anti-Westernism is that it's very negative. It's very much a denial or negation of the West as such. It's not, actually, when you look at Russian alternatives, they are not so much alternatives per se, not positive alternatives, but simply a negation of what is allegedly being offered by the West. For instance, family values. What kind of measures do we see out there in terms of promoting traditional family values? It's mostly repression. It's the repression, first of all, against the LGBT, and then against potentially other forms of deviant or non-traditional behavior, including even divorce. I mean, there are continuous proposals or repeated proposals to introduce fees for divorce, or otherwise punish people for not sticking to their traditional family structures and so on. Single mothers are being targeted sometimes, but these are not decisions. The real decisions which have been taken are mostly against non-traditional sexual behavior. So it's actually not even that much the promotion of certain values as repression against those who behave in a way which is not approved of by the conservatives. Then to a large extent, it's of course still imitative. And this is especially visible when you come to the Russian promotion of Eurasian values. Eurasian Economic Union, for instance, is first of all copied. The institutions are copied from the European Union structures, with some modification, of course, which is inevitable because it's a different context. But then also, if you really look at the goals of this project and how it is being established. Yes, to some extent, it's an attempt to restore the Soviet Union, maybe in a new form. But again, even this restoration is so much centered on the relations with the West that this really becomes the key goal. I mean, for a while, the key goal for the Eurasian Union was establishing formal relations with the EU. When that failed, the center goal became Ukraine, or it has always been, but Ukraine was driven to the forefront because of the developments also in this country. And in a way, the whole crisis, the whole Ukrainian crisis, its origins are in the fact that Russia was competing against the West over Ukraine and ended up intervening in the country and annexing Crimea and so on. So, I mean, in terms of the development of the Eurasian Union, this whole crisis is very destructive, of course, as we know. Not just in terms of Ukraine being turned away from Russia, but also in terms of reaction in other countries. Look at what Lukashenko is saying, look at what Nazarbayev is saying. They are very disturbed, of course, obviously. They are diplomatic, they continue to be diplomatic, but of course the consequences are very negative. And this is not just a product of miscalculation, it's a product of obsession with the West, which was at the center of this Eurasian project. When it comes to the so-called pivoting to Asia, again, if you look at the debate, at the actual debate, and not just at the result of the opinion polls, what you would see is that whenever, absolutely, like 99.9% of statements, describing the need for Russia to turn to Asia. Whenever they say this, the second phrase immediately after that is because this is an alternative to Europe. So Europe always comes into the picture, Europe or the West. Europe doesn't like us, so we're turning towards Asia. That's the message. The message is not that we are turning towards Asia because there is more dynamics there, or it's more interesting, or because we are an Asian country, or because we are a Eurasian country, which is no longer dependent on the West. But the first part, which is always, or the main part which is emphasized, is that we are not accepted in the West, and therefore we will look for an alternative in Asia. And there was even a funny moment in Putin's otherwise quite disturbing speech at the Valdai Club meeting. When he started to talk about Russia's turning towards Asia, he sounded actually, this whole passage sounded as an apology. What he said effectively was, well, everyone does it. So you should not say that we should not do this. Everyone is turning towards Asia, and we will do the same. And it would be strange if we weren't doing the same. Well, everyone is, of course, in this picture is the West itself. So the West remains like the main actor out there, the main subject of global history, whereas Russia is simply doing something that the West does, and it's both negative and imitative. So what I would argue is that there is very little substance in Russia's so-called alternative or conservative policy. Whenever you look deeper, whenever you look beyond simple formula which the pollsters used and try to reconstruct the substance behind this. This is purely negative, actually. But unfortunately, this is not an optimistic conclusion. I mean, in a way, it is optimistic, but in a longer run. But in a shorter run, it's a rather pessimistic statement. Because if Russia had a positive agenda as an alternative, there would be a possibility for compromise. If you are advancing a certain set of positively defined goals, you can always negotiate with your opponent and say, okay, well, you get this as a compromise, we get that, and this is where we stop. This is where we find a common ground. If your own position is purely negative, you cannot stop anywhere. If your opponent compromises, you have to continue to this negative policy. You have to continue pushing forward because you still, your whole identity and your whole self-definition depends on this negation of your opponent. You have to say, okay, well, we are again not being respected. They have accepted this, but that's for their selfish reasons. We have to push forward because we are still not respected enough. We're still, our status as a great power is still not recognized. Our status as whatever important country is still not there, and so on. Indeed, there is no line where this whole thing could stop. And the only institution remaining, I mean, international society institution, which I think is more or less provides a fallback in this situation, is the classical balance of power, unfortunately. I mean, I'm very sorry to say this, and I would probably never say it like 1 year ago or earlier, but anyway, it's optimistic. It's an optimistic conclusion in a different sense, in the sense that since there is no alternative, and since Russia is so dependent on technologies from the West, and Russia is dependent normatively in its identity politics, I think it's inevitable. Barring some catastrophic scenarios. I mean, yes, of course, everything is possible today. But if we look outside of catastrophic scenarios, such as a nuclear war or whatever, if we simply remain on the ground of, well, reasonably rational politics, then there is no alternative for Russia other than simply going back to its traditional catch-up modernization policy, to traditional Eurocentric attitude, and a new attempt to Europeanize itself sooner or later. And I think it will probably happen sooner than we expect. But how painful this transition would be, of course, we don't know, because, and it seems that it will be very painful because the economic situation is in a dead end, and this is where the biggest trouble, I think, for Russia is ahead. Okay, let me stop here, and maybe we can discuss further.
Many thanks, Vyacheslav, for helping us decode Russia's thinking and rhetoric about its most significant other, Europe. I would like to thank all of the 4 panelists for their excellent contributions, and with this I would like to open the floor for questions and comments. If your question is addressed to a particular panelist, please say so. And let's collect several comments, and then the panelists will have a chance to respond.
Thank you very much for your presentation. The last speaker said that we have to believe him, so that's why I want to turn to the field of believings. My question is directed to all the speakers. I would like to ask your opinion about Russian Pravoslav Church role in the system for you, in the national movement for you, in the morale for you, and in economics for you. And my second question is also related to quite a sizable group of Russian society, ex-militaries. What is the role of ex-militaries, not in the system, I know the system, in the nationalism, in moral, and in business, privatization of military activities? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's take a couple more questions.
Thank you. I had very high hopes for this panel, and I was not disappointed. My name is Karolina Vendel-Palin. I'm from the Swedish Defense Research Agency. I would like to ask any of the panelists who would like to offer their conclusions. How do you see the future for Russian society? So far, in an authoritarian system, you basically had a very passive population. The authoritarian rule is based on the passivity of the population rather than mobilization. I was wondering whether you see any possibilities for mobilizing the population. So far, when there's been demonstrations in Moscow for the government, they've actually been rather small, I would say. Even taking into account the considerable resources that probably go into organizing them. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's collect 2 more questions.
Hi, thank you very much. Andras Rats from the Finnish Institute of International Affairs. I'd like to ask Dr. Zubarevic, could you say a few words about the Crimea?
Thank you very much. I'm Ian Bond from the Centre for European Reform in London. I wanted to ask Natalia Yudina in particular whether she could say something about the impact on Russia's other ethnic groups of the shift in Putin's rhetoric to much more concentration on ethnic Russians. I mean, occasionally one sees suggestions in the press that you know, the Tatars, for example, are getting unhappy at the way that the debate is being framed as a result of the shift from, in a sense, talking about Rossianie to talking about Ruskiye and the Ruski Mir. Is that just wishful thinking on the part of some Western commentators? And just one technical question. Natalia Zubarevic's slides were extremely rich in detail. I wondered whether it would be possible to get a copy, because it was quite, there's a lot in there that I would like to study more closely, but it's quite hard to take it in as it flashes across the screen.
Okay. Thank you very much. Shall we start with the questions that were addressed to the specific panelists? Perhaps the last one about the shift, the increasing emphasis of ethnic Russians. Was addressed to Natalia.
It's not easy question. The other ethnic groups, I think, is so big in Russia because not so mobilized as Russian or maybe only Caucasian people. We have one group, for example, so-called Черные ястребы, black eagles, black ox, which was a group of Caucasians, young people that doing something like Russian skinheads. But it's not, I think, enough power for mobilization. It's the question of future.
Would anyone else like to comment on this question? Okay.
About Russian church, it's the difficult question too, because Russian church is also traditional conservative institution in Moscow. And as I can see, this church with our president, the leader of the church, yes, the patriarch with our president Putin together with the main questions.
Economically, Russian church is okay. It has big and absolutely unclear revenues, incomes. Nobody knows the structure, the donators, but they feel fine economically.
Well, when it comes to the matters I was talking about, Orthodox Church, of course, is a part of this conservative turn, and it does have its own agenda, which is, you may say, of course, that this is, yes, a certain positive agenda in the sense of promoting traditional values and religious beliefs and so on. But the problem, once again, is that when it comes to the actual policy implementation, then the church has to rely on the state. It has to rely on its own networks, which is I mean, as any traditional church, it mobilizes its supporters, it sort of promotes and educates them, promotes certain values and so on. But that's by definition a non-political activity. That's a community, part of community life and so on, which is in principle not politicized. And once it gets politicized, it's almost inevitable. Almost by definition, you start looking for enemies. And this is where the state comes in. And this is where it becomes a negative strategy rather than a positive strategy. And in terms of its impact on foreign policy, for instance, and on relations with the West, I don't think it's the church itself which directly influences the state. The church is rather cautious, actually, in this, because the repercussions for the church are not necessarily positive of the recent developments. I mean, the whole mess Russia got into in Ukraine has damaged very much the Moscow Patriarchy's standing in Ukraine. So they're quite ambiguous in that. And it would be a mistake to simply think that the church is behind all these initiatives which are related to anti-gay policies, traditional family value promotions, and so on. It's actually much more ambiguous than that, and it also depends on individual leaders, of course. There are some people who are much more active and vocal, and there are people who are much more cautious. But as an institution, church tries to preserve its autonomy, and therefore it's not necessarily involved in all these matters.
Let me respond briefly to two issues. First, in terms of the Orthodox Church role, in terms of formal institutions, I agree with what Slava said about that. I don't see it as an important actor in some of those major, clan fights close to the top. What I would also add, though, is that some of the people who are important actors in those battles have identified very strongly with the Orthodox Church and see it as a source of ideas and support. The most important is Yakunin, who's head of Russian Railways and who identifies quite strongly as Orthodox and has made it part of his identity, and he has this whole think tank that produces books and reports. Also, the governor of St. Petersburg, the mayor of St. Petersburg, Poltavchenko, also identifies very strongly in that respect. And I mentioned briefly at one point something about how the system of sort of replacing officials and the vertical ladder for people in terms of advancing in the state administration is kind of broken because of the way the institutions work. People like Yakunin and Poltavchenko have sort of generated alternative sources through Orthodox-friendly societies of, finding replacement cadres in their organizations. So that's kind of a small piece, but maybe part of it. And then in terms of Carolina's question about the passivity of Russian society, no one else has taken a stab at that. So I'll make a few comments. I mean, if you look at the opinion polls, it's quite clear that society feels rather demobilized in the current period, and the expressed willingness of people to participate in demonstrations is as low as it's been in many years in those polls. I guess I would say that I don't see much potential for political mobilization right now. I still think there's potential for economic and social mobilization over the medium term, especially at the regional level, perhaps. And I would also suggest that one thing that Putin and his government have been quite successful in is communicating to the Russian population the danger of Maidan-type events inside Russia, and I think that was one of the goals originally, and one of the reasons that Russia reacted the way it did to the events in Ukraine and Crimea was to prevent at all costs the spread of the Orange Plague to Russia, and the fact that, as James Shear put it yesterday, he's managed to wreck Ukraine. I think that sends a message quite clearly to Russian society, the potentially negative consequences of street demonstrations.
First answer, I have a rule. When I take part in any conference, seminar, summer school, doesn't matter, I recommend everybody who is interested in take my presentation for free, for work, for everything. Please join. And about Crimea. Before Crimea, one additional comment. Vyacheslav told it's a negative movement, and there is no rational barrier to stop it. Let me say yes, we have this barrier. It's economics. It's really economics. Yes, as you remember, the second wave of sanctions had no Russian answer, because the first answer, counter-sanctions, was so crucial for Russian economics, inflation, and so on and so forth. And it means that our top figure now a little more clever, maybe. They have a new experience. Economics matters, really. What about Crimea? Economic estimation. First step. If Ukraine will behave itself roughly, stop all infrastructure connections, it means that Crimean agriculture will die. Market price for Ukrainian water importing to Crimea is about $400 million. The total agricultural output of Crimea is $120 million. Please compare. It's a very easy, simple economic example. Second, to invest in Crimea infrastructure, it takes a lot amount of money. I described a little bit further. This economy has a lot of problems. First of all, the huge share of shadow economy, and no chance to overcome this problem in a few years, as well as infrastructure problems. What are the prospects for money expenditures? We have three variants for investment from budget, federal budget, to Crimea. Additionally, there are plans to create free economic zone and gambling zone to get money. But for gambling zone, it sounds like a joke, no chance to improve. But for free economic zone, we face a huge problem of coming investors. Who will come? Big Russian company? No. They will face problems in a global market. Foreigners? No. But the main driver for Crimea development is getting transfers, big transfers from Russian budget. I counted the first information about federal budget expenditures to Crimea, and what are they? The share of transfers now for Crimea is 83% of total budget revenues. And the amount of money per year is about 160 billion rubles. Is it big or not? Look at this. These are all transfers for Far East Federal District. These are for North Caucasus Federal District. And these for Crimea. Good news. Good news. I hope I made answer for your question.
Thank you very much. Before we collect the next round of questions, does anyone quickly want to comment on the question on ex-militaries? I think this has not been addressed.
It's not for me.
Anyone?
Vyacheslav вам придется.
Well, I'm not sure whether we really can single out the ex-military as a separate category. Because, I think, let me put it in this context. Russian society, I don't have the figures in my head, of course, but Russian society is heavily militarized in many respects. And if I may use this term, securitized, in the sense that, again, I don't have the figures, but millions of people work in security. And the ex-military, of course, is a major part of it. In security, meaning not just security services per se, but of course also private security companies, security guards at schools, and so on. And this is really a huge sector of the Russian economy, which has an effect in many respects. It is a sector which is traditionally, of course, more conservative than the average society. It is a sector which, therefore, supports the ideological transformation which I was talking about. It is a sector which is traditionally loyal to the government because it's this law and order mentality and so on. So this is a base, to some extent, this is the base for support for the regime. The big question, I think, is what happens when. It's no longer if, it's when. When the Russian economy starts to feel the consequences of the crazy policies which have been conducted over the recent years and especially months of the responsible decisions that were taken. I agree with Brian that there is a potential for social mobilization and economic mobilization rather than political mobilization per se. And again, this mobilization can take different forms, of course. It's possible that some of these people would come, would riot or at least come to the streets under nationalist slogans, some others with kind of social democratic slogans. But the main thing is that if the state is unable to meet its social commitments, then there will be, of course, mobilization. And again, ex-military is part of the picture because normally if a person works as a security guard somewhere, mostly he, would still rely on the pension, the state pension. So if the pensions are simply devalued, even not you know, they remain to be paid on time, but their purchasing value drops. This already creates a potential for mobilization. And it's very difficult to estimate how high this potential is, but there is a potential, definitely.
Thank you very much, Vyacheslav. I think we will manage to take 2 or 3 brief questions. The answers this time will have to be relatively brief as well. So please.
Hello, my name is Ekaterina Kalina, Swedish National Defense College. I have a question to all of you, and it's more like a comment to the previous discussion we just had about political mobilization. I'm thinking that, isn't it that we focus too much on the political mobilization and on demonstrations? Maybe we should look at the forms of non-political or semi-political forms of civic engagement, and then we can look at the Russian society not as a society that is very passive, but actually might be more active than we think.
I try to answer. No.
Thank you. Lieutenant Colonel Matthias from Boltef Call, directing staff. I have a question regarding the social composition of the power in Russia. As I see it, we are still in the remnants of the post-Soviet Union. The leaders are grown up in the Soviet Union, are being in power right now. And there is a breakage point when more people have grown up after the Soviet Union collapse. Are we seeing any indications on when those people with perhaps more liberal thoughts, being susceptible to Western influences, are coming into power or actually can influence the political situation in Russia? So are we seeing any indications of that? And the second part then, of course, when do we see that shift to the big brother generation?
Hello, I'm Pablo Irat. I'm journalist for Spanish media. Just, well, first of all, thank you for the picture the four of you have painted. It's been really interesting. Just if you could quickly comment on the future or the role of the media and the consolidation of this system. You've labeled Putinism and its future in Russia today. But overall, I wouldn't like to leave without you elaborating a little bit more on how far can this go on? Because the data, the economic data, and your four explanations combined paint a very bleak picture, and I don't know how sustainable that, and how it would stop going on. How would that look? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's this time go panelist by panelist, and please keep your remarks relatively brief. Starting with Brian.
Thanks for the questions. Let me respond to a couple of them. I'm going to skip the other forms of civic engagement because I don't feel qualified to answer, so I apologize. In terms of social composition, I would say two things. There hasn't been as much turnover as one might hope in terms of what might be considered a post-Soviet generation into real important positions of leadership. But I also think the opinion polls suggest that there's no reason to think that next generation is more liberal or more pro-Western than the previous generation. At least that's what I've seen from the polling data. In terms of the media, you may well know that the picture has gotten worse in the last couple of years. There was the reorganization of RIA Novosti, which was a state agency, but one that was seen as more or less professional into a format that is likely to make it less professional, I would say. And I think the recent law on foreign share of ownership is quite worrying, and looks to me, and maybe this is just because I study politics, is directed very much at one specific newspaper, Vedomosti, which is the best Russian newspaper and a quite objective and professional paper, and one which is actually quite useful to people who work in the Russian state and want good information about what's going on. If Vedomosti changes ownership and comes under the control of Kovalchuk or one of the other oligarchs who are active in media, I don't have high hopes for the development of even the print media, which so far has been, much less influenced by these state campaigns against the media than the broadcast media. And obviously, we also know the recent story about Echo Moskvy maybe coming under certain pressure. It's unclear how that's going to play out. And then your last question, how far can this go on? I mean, political scientists are very bad at predicting, especially predicting the future. It's easier to predict the past. So I guess I would end my comments on a rather pessimistic note that despite the gloomy picture we've all painted, that does not mean that there's some break point coming. It can go on. I mean, go on in a form in which, it's sort of muddling along, muddling down, but still go on for quite some time.
Thank you. Natalia, Yudina, is there anything you would like to comment on?
Yeah, I say a few words about new generation in addition to Brian. I think that new generation will be more conservative than previous. I think the more liberal generation, it's people which born in 1970s and something like that. They knew something about freedom. They had a lot of something influence, but new generation has had so conservative subjects and with influence of Russian Orthodox Church. I think they're not so freedom as previous.
Vyacheslav?
I agree with Natalia, and I would add that the new generation has no personal experience of living in the Soviet Union. Unlike the generation around 40, plus or minus, who still remember, at least, the latest moments of the Soviet Union, the empty shelves, the lines for most basic things. This is part of our generation's memory. And also, yes, ideological, the ideological kind of impotence of the late Soviet regime. And also the experience of freedom of the late 80s, early 90s, the discussions, the new discoveries, which were for our generation, for instance, this was really new because we didn't really hear, apart from those who were coming from, really narrow dissident circles. We didn't hear that much about Stalinism, repressions, and so on. The next generation has no personal experience and has a different attitude. So. And they are more indoctrinated, maybe because of that, I don't know. But there is I think, this tendency. Well, I don't know if I can add much on anything else. Maybe on this question of social mobilization versus political mobilization, or generally non-political mobilization. My impression is that there is a very limited scope for that at the moment. And it's, well, you might provide cultural explanations, you might provide, structural explanations, but generally speaking, it's a fact that even the basic needs, community needs, are not solved through civil society institutions. They are mostly delegated, or people expect someone to come in and solve the most basic questions, such as, local order and I mean the state of their yards and stairwells and things like that. It has been extremely difficult, for instance, to form residence communities, or I'm not sure about the proper English term, but the condominia, which would run residential buildings and so on. This was a huge problem, and even the state, with all its incentives it provided, it didn't really work out that well. As for the rest, well, for forecasts, I agree with Brian. It's very difficult to predict, and there are too many unknowns that are out there. In principle, it's possible to manipulate the rents, to play with the currency rates, and indoctrinate people more. I mean, we never know where the end of this process is, but we know that it's coming, but when, we don't know.
Thank you, Vyacheslav. Natalia Zubarevich, any final thoughts?
The Bible gives us an answer. 40 years, 2 generations. This one, the young generation, have been grown up in a situation of frustration. They're shocked by the 90s and their families as well. They know nothing about Soviet past. They know only myths, not reality. And the level of support, Putin personal support, the highest in the young generation and the elderly generation. Clear answer. We are waiting for 20 years, I think. The second, non-political mobilization. Look at this, please. Yes, Russia's personal income stopped to grow in Russia, but pensions, first electoral group, are growing up. Public sector employers, the second electoral group, are growing up and will do it. But the number of employers will be shorter, but the level will grow. And all types of siloviks, army men, policemen, security services men, 2-time jump of wages, and all people included in federal and regional level of power as well. Very clear and very clever composition of support. The main electoral groups and the structure which should and will keep your power. It's very clever. But who are those who pushed out from this new type of social contract? For example, me. We are not protesters. Urban people with high level of education started protests 2 years before, and we all have negative experience, no answer. So the main form of protests, personal choice, will be emigration. Unfortunately, this change is clearly estimating.
Thank you very much for these final thoughts. Thank you for your excellent contributions as well as questions and comments. Brief information from the organizers. The break for refreshments will be limited to 15 minutes, and then we will reconvene in this room for the concluding session of the conference. And now please join me in thanking our panel as well as the organizers of the conference.